Another edition of Distant Crosby, living in Alaska, trying to teach in Texas. So, again, I apologize for the nature of this. This is not ideal, I know. It's not as fun to give sitting in a bedroom in Alaska speaking to a mic, but I do hope to give you something along the way of value as we kind of look at this. So tonight, today, actually, you're going to be watching this Wednesday. You're going to be looking at the powers of Congress and what exactly Congress does or does not do, in fact. So many times we look at Congress and there's a lot of negative perceptions of what Congress does or doesn't do. And one of the big things we kind of unpacked in class is the notion that Congress wasn't designed to do a whole lot. And the notion of the design is we kind of look at this gridlock on Capitol Hill and suggest that, well, something's messed up about Congress, something's wrong with Congress. And I would humbly suggest that's not accurate. This is exactly what the Founding Fathers designed. This is what they wanted. They didn't want a lot being accomplished at the national level, and that's something we're going to discuss tonight as we look at the powers of Congress. Remember from our discussion earlier on that the Founding Fathers wrote in the Federalist Papers that it's not possible to give each department an equal power of self-defense. In a Republican government, which we have, a government that renders some kind of public input to the government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. And so the lawmaking authority necessarily becomes the strongest element of all government. So of all the powers we gave government, the power to make law necessarily predominates. And the reason for this is because the extension of making law carries into the other two branches. So if the legislative branch gets to make the law, all right, then the executive branch gets to execute the law that is made. And the judiciary likewise gets to adjudicate the law that is made. So by making the law or limiting the lawmaking process, we by extension limit the other two branches to the extent that the other two branches stay within the constitutional limitations. And so the idea here of the Founding Fathers suggests that it is this branch here, the lawmaking process, that both empowers the whole of the federal government and limits the whole of the federal government. And so we're going to see a process that's very intentionally set up. Most of y'all know kind of the general setup: 435 members of the House of Representatives, 100 members of the Senate, giving us 535 individuals that are currently kind of there to make law. The process also involves the President of the United States, which is this right here, which is a highly I kind of have a joke there, highly political, self-appointed savior of the United States, because of the way we do the presidential election today, which we've already discussed. But it's important to understand that the president does not have a positive legislative power. They have a negative legislative power only. The veto can stop law, but it cannot create law, which is why so often presidents are really beholden to Congress for whatever law is going to get through. A really great case of this is of the Affordable Care Act, which, even though it's called Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act is very different from what Obama himself really wanted in the legislation. The Affordable Care Act is what could get through the complications of the process. And that's where, very simple terms, the Constitution simply says every bill which shall pass the House of Representatives and the Senate shall, before it become law, be presented to the President. So if anything is going to pass as law in the United States, it has to get through the House of Representatives, and the same exact law has to get through the Senate. Or it has to get through the Senate and then get through the House of Representatives. Either way, it has to gain the affirmation of both branches of Congress, both of the chambers, the houses of Congress, in order to get to the president, and the president still has to affirm it. In other words, the president need not get in its way. And this creates a very complicated process of actually passing anything in the United States. So the first thing I want to go over tonight is what can we reasonably expect from any member of Congress? And so what we see is in political science, the legislative odds. If you want to kind of take polling on what is likely to happen, there are three given scenarios that happen in every electoral setting. So we elect our officials every 2 years. So we elected in 2020. We elected again in 2022. We'll elect again in 2024, right? So we have in that system, we have a bicameral legislature. So we have two houses of the legislature. We have an executive oversight or a president, and we have a dominant two-party system. So the question becomes, which one of the two-party systems control the three elements of law? So if I have the House of Representatives, right, and then I have the Senate, and then I have the presidency, then I begin to look at which political party controls each controlling agency. So if the Republicans control the House of Representatives and the Republicans control the Senate and the Republicans control the POTUS, the presidency, that is going to be a trifecta. The Republican Party controls all three elements of the lawmaking process. Now, this isn't the case. I actually may have confused you a little bit there because in 2020 that did not actually happen. So let's actually erase this, right, and look at in 2020 we had something unique happen, because in 2020 what actually happened is that the Republicans, right, held the House of Representatives. The Senate was actually taken over by the Democrats with the tying vote of Kamala Harris. So the Democrats took the Senate, and the presidency was controlled by Joe Biden, right? So in 2022, the presidency didn't change. The Democrats held the Senate, and the Republicans held the House of Representatives. So let me change the color here and show you kind of what we're talking about. Because in this scenario, based on these three elements, we can predictively kind of look at what's likely to happen. Political scientists look at this and they say, what is the kind of condition of government? And in every government with these three, you have three possible conditions. The first condition is what we call unified government. In unified government, it means all three of these elements are the same. So the same party controls the House of Representatives, Senate, and the presidency. In divided branches, it means that Congress, the House of Representatives, the Senate are unified by the same party, and then the presidency is owned and controlled by the different party or the opposition. In a divided chambers, what divided chambers means is that the House of Representatives is controlled by one party and the Senate is controlled by a different party, right? And so divided chambers is what we have had in recent memory. The last several years, we have had divided chambers. Now, what we have done is we've gone back historically and analyzed what is the likeliness that law is passed in this type of government, in this type of government, and in this type of government. So when there is unified government and one party controls all three elements of the lawmaking process, what is the likeliness of major legislation getting passed? If it's a divided branches, again, what is the likeliness? And divided chambers. Now, this may surprise you, but this was the result. Going back and looking at all the major legislation since the 1940s, when one party controls all three elements of government, we see a strong tendency of producing a large amount of major legislation each year. And so we see in this case, the highest, most predictable element is if one party controls the House of Representatives, the same party controls the Senate, and the same party controls the presidency, the odds of legislation getting through Congress is relatively high, right? Still low comparatively. It's still only 13 major pieces of legislation, but right, it's still relatively high. But what many people get surprised is this. If I look at divided branches where Congress is unified under one party and the presidency shares a different party, we actually don't see that much of a decrease in the expected amount of legislation. In other words, it seems relatively easy if we have the presidency that can negotiate from a position of one, whereas if Congress is divided between what we call split chambers, that negotiation from one goes away. When we see the biggest decline in the expected amount of legislation is actually when we see Congress is fighting itself. When the House of Representatives is controlled by one party and the Senate is controlled by the opposing party, the amount of legislation we can reasonably expect get through Congress goes down dramatically. And remember, that's exactly what we have seen over the past few years. So when a lot of people look at Congress today and they say, well, Congress isn't getting anything done, we had another budget crisis, we had a debt crisis, all of these things that we kind of throw out, I sit back from a political scientist point of view and say that's what we should have reasonably expected. Given the fact that the Republicans control the House of Representatives and the Democrats control the Senate, we should reasonably expect a low level of information or legislation getting through Congress right now. This is just predictive analysis. This is exactly what we've had historically, and it's exactly what we'll continue to see in the near future because of the nature of this divided chambers. It significantly retards the element of government. And so when we look back historically over this, you can see these last two here on when we have had this happen, right? So we see a lot of times where going back to Eisenhower, we had a unified Congress, and then we had a unified Congress, even though we had the Democrats controlling Congress really from Eisenhower all the way to Carter. The presidency went to the Republican Party, but we saw a strong kind of unification of at least the Democrats, at least in name, because there's a split in the Democrat Party here, which requires a little bit more validation, which we won't get into here. There's a certain unification here. However, under Reagan, we see a split under Reagan, which complicates the narrative under Reagan. H.W. Bush had a unified Congress, but of the opposing party, right? George W. Bush, once again, had a unified Congress, where Clinton and Bush typically had a unified Congress, but of a different party, at least for Clinton. W. Bush was working. So we would reasonably expect major pieces of legislation passed where we see all reds or where we see all blues. And that's exactly what happens over here, right? Those time periods where we see all reds and all blues, Obama's first 2 years in office, we see all blues, and predictably, we see the passage of the Affordable Care Act. During Trump's administration, his first 2 years, all red, and predictably, we see kind of a banner year for kind of this control of Congress. And so as we look at this, we've seen brief periods of this, but like I said, Obama had 1 year, and then we split Congress, and he spends 4 years at Congress going at its throat. Trump had 2 years of a unified Congress, and then since Trump's since Trump's third year in Congress, rather, we have seen a divided Congress. And so a lot of what we're seeing and manifest in the congressional setting of the United States is really just a product of our voting tendencies. We have voted one party in one chamber and another party in the other chamber, which is going to produce calamity. I'm not going to go over this. I'm going to put a couple videos up for you to work on this. The book is all on this as well, on how a bill becomes a law. What you need to know is it's incredibly complicated. And you also need to know the basic steps. A bill is going to be an idea for a law. Every bill is going to be introduced. Once the introduction, it's going to be done in committee. So we have a bill is written and introduced, and then it goes into committee, right? Once it gets to the committee, which many times it does not. Committees are where bills go to die, right? In the committee work, this is where a lot of times the bills will go. Either they won't have public affirmation, they won't get the budgetary consideration, we can't pay for them. 5 million reasons why a bill may die here. If it gets out of committee, it goes into what we call full chamber session. In a full chamber session, it has to gain the affirmation of the full chamber, whether it be the House of Representatives or the Senate. If it gets through that full chamber, now it has to go in the opposite chamber, and then it has to get through their process as well. Right? So we begin in the House or the Senate. All legislation can begin either a House or the Senate, with the notable exception of tax legislation. Any tax legislation has to begin in the House of Representatives. Otherwise, it can begin in the House or the Senate. Right? So if it begins in the Senate, it goes into committee work, it goes into full chamber, then it's kicked to the House. If it begins in the House, it's introduced, it goes to the committee, it goes then to full chamber, and then it's kicked to the Senate. So the key is the exact same piece of legislation has to pass both chambers. If the legislation changes, there's a lot of legal stuff that happens. Sometimes we use reconciliation, which can iron out differences. But typically speaking, if I have a version of the bill here in the House and a version of the bill in the Senate, then I kick it to what's called a conference committee. I'm not going to make you know all the committees, but you do need to know the conference committee. A conference committee is made up of half senators and half House of Representative members. And what they do is they iron out the differences between the Senate version of the bill and the House version of the bill in order to gain some type of unified version. If they are successful, the unified version is kicked back for full chamber votes in both the House and the Senate before it goes to the president for final approval. If the members of the conference committee cannot agree on the legislation, then effectively the legislation dies in conference committee. So this is in the notes. Like I said, I'm going to publish a video on, or I'm going to link a video that this is all over the web on how this is done. What you need to know really is the complications. And regardless of unified government, divided government, we have this still. So even if the Republicans are in control of both chambers, the odds of legislation getting through the complications set here are still astronomically low. In other words, the founding fathers of the United States, in order to maintain limited government, they created a system that is very unlikely to produce a lot of legislation. The system is just designed to kill federal action for a lot of reasons. This is another more simplified version of it. Remember, it goes in the House, it's introduced, it goes into committee work, it goes into full chamber, and then it has to go over here to get through the Senate process, and then it goes in. This right here represents the conference committee. If we can iron out and get the same exact bill passing both chambers, then and only then does it go to the president. And as many of you know, the president can veto the bill or he can sign the bill. If the president doesn't sign it or veto it, then it depends on what it does. And I have this fancy little chart for you on the president in the notes. All right. So if you've ever seen that Schoolhouse Rock of I'm Just a Bill, that essentially is the process in a nutshell of I'm a bill and I've got to go through all these messy steps and whatnot to get it. Right. The interesting thing that I want you to know is this. John Dingell was a representative from Michigan, actually once commented, he said, if I give you substance and you give me process, I'll screw you every time. A lot of times we want to say that good ideas win the day, all right? However, when you get into what's called parliamentary procedure or the legal components of passing law, you actually have to understand how the process works. Excuse me. If you do not understand how the process works, it does not matter how good your idea is. Somebody will kill the idea in the process. And this is a lesson so many students don't understand. I have so many students come to my class and say, well, Crosby, why don't they just? Why don't they just? Why don't they just? It's so easy. All they have to do is this. Well, if the Republicans are in control of things and they have a clear thing that's publicly and supported, well, the Democrats may want to tank it just because they don't want to give the Republicans the affirmation or public support. Likewise, if the Democrats are in control and they have a really good idea that they're going to pass and the public loves it, it's going to fix everything, the Republicans may have an incentive to usurp it or kind of alienate it and cut the legs out from underneath it to prevent the Democrats from getting a win. Yes, I kid you not, who gets credit for legislation is a big part of this kind of partisan debate and partisan divide that goes along with Congress. And I'm telling you, you can have the best ideas you want to. It's those that understand the process, those that actually understand parliamentary procedure and how to get it through this system, how to play the game. Those are the ones that succeed as lawmakers. You have to know how to play the game. And it's not corrupt. It's not bad. It's the way life works, right? With any business, with anything, you've got to figure out how is this managed? What are the rules? How do I work within the rules and allow it to accomplish something? And even how do I fix the rules? If you're going to fix the rules, you still have to fix the rules within the rules themselves. And so you have to understand the rules even to fix the rules. So understanding this is a key component in being successful. Like I said, the president has a couple options on this. He can sign it. If he signs it, it becomes law. If he vetoes it, it's killed and it's returned to Congress with the president's objections. And so the president can say, I'm vetoing him for these reasons, and then Congress can address them. If the president does nothing, this gets kind of complicated, but it really depends on, is Congress in session? So the president has not done anything within 10 days. On the 10th day, if Congress is in session, the bill becomes law without the president's signature. If Congress is not in session, then the bill is effectively killed and the president doesn't really have to do anything. He just lets it die because Congress is not in session, effectively because there is no Congress to return the bill to. So why would a president exercise this option to do nothing? Well, maybe he allows it to become law, but he doesn't want his name on it, right? Why would he allow it to veto? Because maybe he wants the bill to die and he doesn't actually want to be responsible for it. So there's a lot of political reasons why a president would do this, and we have had several presidents kind of do this. However, when you look at the presidential veto has become far more powerful than it was originally intended to be, because originally we were supposed to have kind of this congressional setup in Congress supposed to combat the presidency for power. So the tug of war, if you will, was supposed to be a congressional tug of war against the president, the presidency versus Congress. However, since Congress became bifurcated between the two parties and the president jumps into one of the two sides of Congress, Congress very rarely has the 2/3 vote necessary to override a presidential veto. What that has done in the modern session is the presidential veto carries a substantially larger weight than the founding fathers ever intended it to be. And we see this in the data. So if I look at the number of vetoes that a president has done, I can actually see the total vetoes actually passed by a president here. Trump had 10 up to this point. Obama had 12. Clinton had 37. If you look down here, some of the bigger ones, Truman, right? Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 635. Truman had 250. Dwight D. Eisenhower had 181. So we have the presidents, at least the modern presidents, have been very liberal with their use of the veto. But look at this next one. Of the vetoes that have been overridden, very few of them have actually been overridden by Congress. So in the modern iteration of this kind of governmental setup, we really don't see Congress battling the presidency so much as we see one party battling the other party. And the presidency has become a tool used by partisan politics, and Congress has also become a tool used by partisan politics. Once again, the nobility of the system or the integrity of the system has been kind of perverted by party politics, right? Really quickly, I also want to go over the powers of Congress because I think this is telling. When we look at what the founding fathers wanted the government of the United States to do, in Article 1, Section 8, they outline what was Congress supposed to do. It says Congress shall have the power to do what, right? If I look at this limited form of government where I set up a federal government, and remember, they were establishing a federal government when they highly feared government. Remember, they had just recently got out of the tyranny of the king. They had just revolted from the English government that they believed was tyrannical, but they also failed to establish a democratic government under the Articles of Confederation. So they're building a republic, and they're going to empower that republic with a national government, but they want that national government to remain limited. Remember, Madison wrote in Federalist 10 that those things that carry a uniformity or a national appeal need to be given to the federal government, where those things that are local in nature should be reserved to the states. So what I find very fascinating is they actually then give us insight by what they put in the Constitution, all right, what's called enumerated powers, the things they specifically detailed in the Constitution, give us an idea of what they held in unison nationally, right? What they argued at the time needed to be taken care of on a national level. And I think this is very instructive for us today, right? We're also going to unpack a little bit of implied powers, which are powers that should be connected to the enumerated powers, and then the inherent powers and reserved powers. But first, I want to kind of go into these enumerated powers. The enumerated powers, like I said, is anything specifically written in black and white in the Constitution. And if you analyze this, what you find out is really, really interesting. The first part is you're going to find two things. Number one, you're going to find protect the borders. All right. Protect the borders is very, very clear. Establish and protect the borders. Decide who is an American and who is not an American, right? This is something they decided needed to be done on a national scale to establish a uniform rule of naturalization and uniform laws on the subject of, well, bankruptcies throughout the United States. So we need to protect the borders, right? Decide who's an American. And when they look at bankruptcies, we need to develop national financial security. And that says it's like my whiteboard writing here, right? So when you look at what the founding fathers decided needed to be done, almost everything in here is going to be tied to protect the nation from external threats militarily, right? Protect the borders and secure sound finances, right? So if I look at this, rule of nationalization, all right, who is a citizen? Bankruptcies, coin money, regulate the value of money, regulate the value of standard weights and measurements. In other words, financial system, right? To provide for punishments of counterfeiting and securities of current coins. Once again, sound finance. To establish post office and post roads, we need sound communication. That one's going to get into communication to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times authors and inventors exclusive rights to respective writings and discoveries. Now, this is something where a lot of people look at the National Endowment of the Arts, and I think the key here is useful arts, right? In other words, we believe that certain things benefited us as a nation. Inventions drive us forward. There is a reason that NASA exists, and there's a reason that NASA has created a ton of technology that we use in weapons and defense, right? So when we start looking at to promote the progress of science, fund NASA. Right? It amazes me how often we talk about the difference in funding welfare versus NASA. You will not find anything in the Constitution dealing with an allowance for welfare, but you will find in the Constitution a very, very, very strict kind of direct statement on, yes, fund the sciences. Right? Sciences drive us. Arts drive us. They make us better. They make our nation better. Right? And once again, a lot of that's tied to protecting the borders and securing the nation. The stronger our nation is, the more advanced our nation is, the more scientifically advanced our nation is, the stronger we are collectively. Right? Constitutional triumvirs and inferior Supreme Court, that gets into the legal system of protecting the stability of our nation internally. Once again, protecting the nation from threats, either foreign or domestic. Define piracies and felonies. That gets into, once again, protecting our nation from threats that would destabilize the financial systems. Right? Declare war. I mean, you see what I'm saying. To provide a navy, support armies, right? Regulation of naval forces, call for the militia, organizing army and disciplining the militia for governing whatnot. Once you see what the founding fathers put in writing, it is very clear that the national government should do two things primarily. It should secure the state, right? Defend the state. It should also secure sound finances. In my humble estimation, these are the top two priorities of the federal government. They were in 1787. They remain there today, right? If we are going to have any hope of fixing our nation, we have to get back to these two priorities. What do we have to do to secure the state from threats that would destabilize it, either external threats or internal threats? And how do we secure our financial system? This is Hamilton's legacy. How do we actually guarantee the financial system of the United States does not bring us to ruin? Why is this important? Rome lasted for nearly 1,000 years. And Rome is going to fall basically because of two reasons. They lose the ability to address threats both externally and internally, and their financial system goes belly up with bad credit, extension of debt beyond what they can control, extension of loans beyond what they could reasonably pay back. It is these two components that led to the end of Rome. Right now, what do we have in the United States? We continue to have arguments on what are the threats, what are the national securities, how do we deal with national borders, and we're currently boasting a debt in the United States that is significantly higher than at any other point in our history, right? We are becoming more and more unstable in both of these regards. However, right, going into the presidential election, we're not hearing a whole lot of this. We're not hearing how do we secure the finances. Why? Because a big reason the finances are so in trouble is because of entitlement spending, right? Nobody wants to take it on. The national debt at this time was $17 trillion. It's now about $32 trillion. In the matter of just a few years, we are seeing this skyrocket. In fact, if you ever want to see the debt, go to usdebtclock.org and you'll actually see just how big this is. And the reality is that the American people are the largest creditors. Oftentimes we think it's China or Japan. It's not. The American people have loaned more money to the American government than any other entity. Now, why do we keep spending so much money? It's because of these new entitlement programs. If you look at this, during historic times, we saw during times of war, we took out major loans to fight the war and then we paid it off. We drove our deficit back down. All right, Civil War, we see a spike and then we drive it down. World War I, we see a spike and we begin to drive it down until FDR's New Deal. When we see the reemergence of this new kind of compassion, this what many people refer to as the welfare state, this government should secure a minimum standard living, we have never from that point on been able to stabilize the finances of the United States because so many voters are now tied to federal or government assistance, right? When you start looking at this, it is government assistance programs given directly to voters that require that if I'm a House member, I can't take on those programs. If I'm a senator, I can't take on those programs. The Great Depression is going to spike the spending even though there is no war, right? Now, World War II is going to spike it even more, but notice we do come down off the war spending, but we never come down to neutral. We are always going to be spending more money than we take in, even when we don't really have continuations of war. And even here, we've got the Vietnam War in here, we've got Iraq and Afghanistan, but we don't see these traditional spikes because the big expenditure is no longer the military. A lot of people think it's the military. It's not. The biggest expenditures are growing in. Guys, look at this. The net interest on stuff that we have already borrowed, right? So it used to be we paid for stuff. Now we're beginning to pay more money for the stuff we've already purchased historically, right? And the biggest drivers of the debt is government entitlement programs, Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security, right? I don't care what anybody else tells you, right? It's no longer military spending that is driving up the debt. What is driving up the debt are government entitlement programs, right, in the form of Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare that we simply do not have control over. And it's those programs that we cannot afford. We could not afford them here, and we had to borrow a bunch of money. And the more money we borrow, the more money we have to pay back. And so those programs are really responsible for driving up huge debts, right? Now, why can't we take it on? Because once people get used to money, it's the voters that don't want to get rid of the money. So if I look at the Biden $1.9 trillion COVID spending, right? Who favored it? Well, we did, right? 70% of the American people favored the government giving us money, right? 94% of Democrats, 41% of Republicans, right? We like the government handing out money. However, if we look at, did that money handed out actually have a great impact on our economy? The answer is no, it didn't. we really didn't see a lot of benefit from that economic enhancement plan. Now, we did see some greater benefit from the unemployment compensation. We did see some benefit from the paycheck protection, but the amount of money we spent here for the relative gain we got was astronomically small. But Biden made it a key part of his campaign in 2020 to guarantee the American people would get more money. Right? So when you look at shares of total taxes, we want to say, well, this is fair because the rich need to pay their fair share. The top 1% already pay more in taxes than the amount of money that they control, right? So if they control 20.9% of the overall wealth in the United States, they pay 24% of the overall taxes paid. In fact, if you look at almost every upper level wealthy group, right, in the top 20%, each of them, right, pay a higher percentage of the respective economy or economic wealth that they control. And so when we say tax the rich are being taxed to a large extent. They make up the biggest percentage of federal taxes. The poor pay a less percentage, right? So if I look at the bottom 60% of Americans, the bottom, what is this, 20%, 40, this is 80% of Americans here, right? So if I cut this off the 80% mark, each of the bottom 80% actually pay less as a percent in taxes than they do of the wealth that they control, right? And so this is something that it requires a better conversation on what we want. Now, why don't they take this on? Well, because Democrats and Republicans, nobody wants to cut funding. If you cut funding from Medicaid or Medicare or Social Security, you're going to lose votes. And once you start handing out money, nobody wants to take on entitlements. And so this becomes a very, very difficult issue to take on. And yet, most Americans sit back every election and say, mine, 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 not realizing just what is the overall condition of our financial security. And so, one of the key components that the Founding Fathers said was eminently important for our nation to stabilize, to guarantee we get right. We have blown that completely out of proportion in exchange for arguments over gay marriage, arguments over abortion rights, arguments over marriage rights between who knows who, arguments over gun rights and gun legislation, right? Those things, while they may be important, I would humbly suggest, are they more important than the physical defense of our nation from threats external and internal, and the financial security of our nation? It seems like these two need to be checked first before our nation or our Congress really addresses anything else. The next thing we have are implied powers. Now, these are powers that are supposed to be connected to the enumerated powers. In other words, these are powers that need to be allowed to accomplish these. So one of the big arguments historically is the national bank, right? So do we need a national bank to help establish and coin currency? Well, in short, the federal government said, yes, we do, right? The national bank is established to help join currency. And so if we look at these, we know this is what's called the elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause. And it says to make all laws which will be necessary and proper for carrying an execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested in the Constitution and government of the United States. In other words, implied powers are made possible via this elastic clause. This is in the Constitution, but the key to this is that shall make all that are necessary and proper for carrying in the execution the foregoing powers. In other words, any implied power should be directly connected to an enumerated power, right? And this is where we have gotten really creative in modern history, right? I'm not going to go into full detail because I'm not there and you're probably already tired of hearing this lecture. But what you need to understand is this notion of the implied power and how long the rubber band stretches is completely dependent on the Supreme Court interpretation. So if an implied power is adequately connected to an enumerated power, right? Remember, an implied power has to be connected to an enumerated power. That connection is determined by the Supreme Court. Sometimes the Supreme Court says, yes, it is connected and should be allowed. Sometimes the Supreme Court says it's not connected and it should not be allowed. So in the case of this notion of the bank, it was the Supreme Court that got to decide that. In McCullough versus Maryland, the question of the bank went to the Supreme Court, and John Marshall in the Supreme Court, previous decision of Marbury versus Madison, right? He argued that the Supreme Court is the final arbitrator. So in 1819, the Supreme Court gets to be the final arbitrator in whether or not the bank is allowed. It's not mentioned directly in the Constitution, but coining money is. So, can the Congress establish a national bank as a method, as an implied element to carry out the enumerated powers? The Supreme Court said yes. Felix Frankfurter argued that this notion of expounding upon the Constitution, right, that we're explaining it as we go, that the Supreme Court gets to decide just what is implied in the Constitution, right? That is the role of the Supreme Court. Well, a disciplined Supreme Court is going to stay very close to the Constitution, the wording of it. An undisciplined or politically engineered Supreme Court may get farther away from the Constitution into what we see more of a progressive court or a modern interpretive court. And we'll actually discuss that later on in class, right? And so what it does is it really puts SCOTUS, or the Supreme Court of the United States, in the driver's seat of deciding just what is implied in the Constitution and what is not implied. So we have this kind of balance of power that was supposed to exist, and we see this playing out. Right? I want to end with this on the Commerce Clause, because the Commerce Clause is a really good example of what we mean by implied powers. Now, the exact enumerated power says to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among several states. So we can regulate commerce with foreign nations and among several states. So anything that goes in and out of states, anything that deals with the buying and selling of goods, the national government can regulate, right? So this is a pretty staple part. In order to guarantee financial systems, the United States can regulate money and can regulate what's bought and sold on the open markets if it goes between nations and if it goes between states, and we call it intrastate commerce, right? So, interstate commerce. So when we have SCOTUS determines application, and here's where it gets interesting. In Gibbons versus Ogden, we had a Supreme Court case where an international merchant wanted to go into New York and use the New York waterways to sell stuff, right? So what they argued is that they controlled New York, and the federal charter had to pay state taxes in order to basically use the state riverway. What the Supreme Court said was no. Since rivers flow outside of state boundaries, then anything that flows, any commercial flowing that goes across state boundaries is under federal regulation, not state regulation, which means the federal government trumps any or any commerce that crosses state lines. So what that means today is anything that goes in the federal highway system is subject to federal law. So in theory, if you're in Colorado and you purchase marijuana, if you're on a back road, you can theoretically not get in trouble because marijuana is legal in Colorado. But the moment you take that marijuana onto a federal highway, you're under federal law, and a federal agent can now arrest you for possession of a federal narcotic. All right, not a narcotic, but federal drug. And so when you see this, that's important to understand. So once again, the Supreme Court got to decide just to what extent is implied by this enumerated power. So it's something, it's in black and white, right? But how far this stretches and what exactly this means falls to the purview of the Supreme Court as disputes arise. Now it gets really interesting. In Hammer versus Dagenhart, the federal government was asked to determine whether or not labor, right? Is labor part of commerce? Yes or no, right? In basic economics, we have two systems of labor. One of the exchanges is what we call a product market. In a product market, we exchange products for money. All right. So you get a product. In exchange for that, you actually pay money. All right. This is the market traditionally managed by the federal government or any government. They decide what is bought and sold on the market. However, in every economic system, there's also an additional market, and that market is called the labor market. In the labor market, you sell your labor to a business, and that business pays you for your labor, right? So here you are as an individual, and you may sell your labor to HEB. HEB buys your labor and gives you money. You then take that money over here to the product market and you use your money to buy products. And so we have two different exchanges of the market. We have a product market and we have a labor market. Well, historically speaking, the product market was the market underneath federal regulation. Well, in Hammer versus Dagenhart, right, a group said, well, why isn't labor connected under the regulation of commerce as well? If we're regulating commerce, shouldn't labor be a part of that as well? In 1918, the Supreme Court said, no, labor is not included because labor is not between foreign nations and labor does not cross several states and it does not involve Indian tribes. Since labor is local, right, primarily in origin, you go and you make a local agreement with a local business. The labor market is primarily a negotiation between you, the laborer, and the person you're selling your labor to. And since the exchange is personal and local, it is not subject to the regulation of the federal government. Well, what happens is this. FDR comes in and begins bullying the Supreme Court. And in 1941, the Supreme Court of the United States, now a different Supreme Court, it's underneath the political pressure of FDR, and it's changed a little bit. We have some new judges on there. In U.S. versus Darby Lumber Company, the Supreme Court of the United States was asked the same exact question it was in Hammer versus Dagenhart. And so in Hammer case, they said no, labor is not included. In the U.S. versus Darby Lumber Company, right, just over 2 decades later, the Supreme Court of the United States said, wait, never mind, yes, labor is included, and the federal government can now regulate the labor market by establishing minimum wage, by establishing federal worker protections, by establishing a federal work week. These aspects that were very, very popular with voters, right? The government of the United States started jumping in and managing this exchange as well. And the important thing to take away from this is this. The Constitution never changed. What Congress could do, did. The Constitution does not change. What Congress could do, did, because of the interpretation on what exactly was implied. And so what happened is the 1940s, 1950s, right? The Supreme Court showed the nation that if a political party can take control of the Supreme Court, then they can manage the relative implied aspects of the Constitution. And if this stretches too far, then essentially we could lose our bearings on just what is constitutional and what is not, right? So like I said, something that was not approved in 1918 was then approved in 1941. So just because the Constitution stays stagnant, it does not mean the interpretation does. Section 9 of 1 gets into some other stuff. I just love this quote by Benjamin Franklin because we did take on these questions of the federal government is intended to manage the collective good. As Benjamin Franklin says, can the sweetening of our tea with sugar be circumstanced with such absolute necessity? Can the petty pleasure thence arising to taste compensate for so much misery? There is an inherent good that the federal government is intended to do, is supposed to do. In regulating the financial systems, in regulating the markets, in guaranteeing financial security and safety and security of our nation, there is a collective good that is made possible through sound government action. And so I always tell my friends on the right, no, all government is not bad. There is a need, there is a function for good government. We realize in the Articles of Confederation we need good laws. But to my friends on the left, I often argue if we stretch what government does too far, beyond the limitations, beyond what the government can reasonably do, now we turn the government into simply a partisan spat and a partisan tool, and this kind of power struggle over who can get the most voters by handing out the most government cash at our detriment to long-term financial security. And so we have to be cognizant of what good government is and how to avoid not having enough government and maybe having too much government, right? And so I will leave you that, and I'll leave you with this image of our government. If Congress is a representation of the people, if Congress is a representation of the voters, if this is the voter, then how can we, the voter, reasonably look into the mirror of Congress, our representatives, without demanding higher qualifications, without demanding longer terms, without demanding accountability for past action, without improving the condition of Congress at all? How can we look into the mirror and see something different than we are? If we are highly partisan, prone to argument, right, prone to financial insecurity, then we can only reasonably expect our representatives in Congress to mirror that image. I will see you on the flip side of the weekend. Until then, I bid you all adieu.